All right, time to talk about the Major League Baseball draft coming up here in 2021 with Carlos Collazo of Baseball America. And Carlos, the Rangers are picking second. I guess, a blessing and a curse. You don't want to be picking second, but that's just the reality. And it's a great opportunity for the Rangers to improve their organization, not just in that round, but in subsequent rounds. But who are some of the names to consider with the top few picks at this point as you forecast for the upcoming draft?
Yeah, for sure. This draft is looking like a pretty exciting one at this point, although there are a lot more question marks kind of overall, just given how 2020 has kind of evolved. But I think probably the first name that you're going to think about is Kumar Rocker. That's the Vanderbilt right-hander. I think at this point, he's probably the presumptive favorite to be the 1-1, just because he is a guy who has pedigree going back to his high school days when he was then a first-round talent as well. He went to Vanderbilt and only proved himself there. And he's one of the few pitchers in this college class who has both stuff and a solid track record of starting performance. I think given the shortened 2020 season with just 4 weeks, there are a lot of pitchers who just haven't had a lot of time to kind of prove themselves or show their stuff translating in a game situation. And Kumar has done that at the biggest levels in the best conference in baseball. So I think he's probably the first guy that you look at. On the high school side, there are two guys at the top of our list right now, both shortstops from the South. The first is Brady House. He's a shortstop out of Georgia who kind of entered the summer as our top prep prospect. He's a guy who has really impressive hitting and power tools with a long track record of hitting as a prep player. The guy who probably had the best summer is Jordan Lawler. He's a shortstop out of Texas. There have been some comparisons to Bobby Witt. He's a really toolsy Texas shortstop, so I could see how you put those comparisons on him. But he's got a chance to have above average tools really across the board. And like I said, he was one of the more impressive hitters against some of the best pitching in the high school class this summer. So those are probably the first few names I would throw out at you if you're looking at guys who could impact the very top of the draft.
So let's start with Kumar Rocker, because during the regular season, a lot of Rangers fans were maybe rooting for losses to be in a position to get Kumar Rocker. Yeah. Other than an injury, do you foresee how much wiggle room is there is Kumar Rocker, as long as he's healthy, a lock to be the 1-1, or do you think there is a little bit of wiggle room?
Yeah, I think there's some wiggle room. I don't know at this point. Probably the only guy that I've said is certainly a lock to be 1-1, barring any injuries, is probably Adley Rutschman. He was the only guy, at least since I've been doing this, that was clearly ahead of the class at that kind of caliber. I think right now it's safe to say that Rocker is certainly the favorite for that spot. I don't want to lock anyone in because who knows what could happen. I think there are a few other pitchers in the college class, like Jaden Hill, the LSU right-hander. He's a guy who might have a tick better pure stuff. He's just one of those guys who's been a reliever at times and hasn't thrown as many innings. So he kind of still has a little bit more to prove. There are some hitters in this class that are really impressive. A guy like Adrian Del Castillo at Miami has been a very solid hitter. Pretty much every season he's had, he's shown track record with a wood bat. So I think the college hitters tend to move up the boards. So depending on what happens in the 2021 spring, there could be players who surpass or eclipse Kumar. But yeah, if Kumar continues to go out and just do what he's done, he has the physicality. He's a big, strong, 6'4", 250-pound right-hander. He's got the pure stuff. I mean, he does profile as a top of the rotation arm, and teams love that profile, obviously, especially when it's coming out of a program like Vanderbilt with SEC track record. So I do think if Kumar stays healthy and continues to do what he's done, he's probably still the favorite.
You can find Carlos's work on Baseball America. It's well worth the subscription, especially if you're a baseball junkie, particularly a draft junkie, but obviously more than just that on Baseball America. But I think you, if I'm not mistaken, like right after this past draft, you kind of did a really early mock for 2021, and Jack Leiter's name was near the top. And that's a really interesting one for me. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's the big league pedigree with his dad and his uncle, but this is he'd be a draft eligible sophomore, if I'm not mistaken, and has just really limited college experience because of what happened due to COVID. What can you tell us about Jack and what makes him so highly thought of?
Yeah, Leiter is similar to Kumar in a lot of ways, and he's also different in a lot of ways. I think the similarities go to him him kind of being a first round talent coming out of high school, a Vanderbilt commit coming out of high school. If the signability was in line with what first round prep players get in the first round, like he priced himself out. I think there are plenty of teams who would have taken him in the first round if they could have afforded him. But he's a guy who he doesn't pitch exactly like Kumar. He's not the kind of power fastball guy that Kumar is. Leiter was a player who is a little bit more polished, as you might expect, considering his bloodlines that you were talking about. But he's got a good fastball. He can kind of put it wherever he wants, or at least he showed that ability as a prep pitcher. A really good hammer curveball, 12-6 shape. He's improved his slider. He has a good changeup. I think he's just a very polished pitcher with good stuff all around. I don't know that he has quite the upside that Kumar does. But again, you talk about the differences between he and Kumar. He only has 15.2 innings under his belt with Vanderbilt. Like you said, he would have been a draft eligible sophomore. I don't know if they're classifying him as a redshirt freshman after 2021. Either way, it's his second year in college and he'll be eligible because of his age. But I think Leiter might have the biggest variance of any player among our college top 10, just because he does have that pedigree in high school. But you really, I don't know, you wouldn't feel comfortable taking a college pitcher this high with just 15 innings. So I think a lot of where he ends up is just going to depend on how he performs in the spring of 2021 and really how he looks this fall. I think more than ever before, this fall for college players and this spring, they're just going to weight more heavily into kind of the all-around profile that scouts have to work with, because it's just a bigger percentage of their innings and their workload.
So obviously DFW is a pretty football crazy area, and it seems like everyone is so in tune with the NFL draft. And the example I use to Rangers fans who are maybe more familiar with the NFL draft is that, you know, a year out, Joe Burrow would never have been the number one overall pick. And now I'm not suggesting that someone who might be a fifth rounder now is going to jump up and be the number one overall pick, but it just goes to show how much a season's worth of, you know, whether it's high school or college games can really change things. So, you know, you do this year in, year out. How much change, like if someone's looking at a mock right now, how much change is typical, you know, over the course of a full season? You got the, you know, fall. I don't even know if colleges are doing fall ball or any sort of fall World Series type stuff. And then of course the seasons in the spring, but how much change is there typically over the course of the 7-8 months leading up to the draft?
Yeah, there's a decent amount. I think kind of looking at our way too early mocks that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, we typically do the first 10 immediately after the most recent draft. And I'd say we do a pretty good job of identifying maybe 5 to 7 players who are going to go in that range. So the top guys of the class generally remain the top guys. So I think there's a cluster of players that you can probably expect to be at the top either way. At the same time, you're right. There's plenty of time for players to develop, for things to change, for players to get hurt. So there are definitely going to be players that jump up that we were expecting to maybe be more of second or third round types, or even guys that we didn't know anything about. There was a player a couple of years ago, Keone Cavaco, a Southern California player who just didn't play on the showcase circuit a ton, so scouts weren't super aware of him, at least at the national level. And he had a very good spring and wound up going in the first round to the Twins. So that happens pretty regularly. I think this year there's a chance to have even more movement than normal, particularly on the college side, because there are some players who early in the 2020 season were showing really improved stuff, or they had improved their control on the mound, or they were kind of looking like different hitters. And scouts didn't really have the time to really bear down and see what was real and what was maybe more small sample noise. There are some players who were maybe injured in the 2020 season that would have been playing later on had the season continued on. And so I think there's just a lot more uncertainty, particularly on that college side. And with teams more and more steering towards the college demographic at a higher rate, I think that's going to be pretty important for next year's class. Just there's a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of players who we're not talking about right now who very well could be solidly in that first round discussion March or April next year.
You mentioned teams kind of gravitating towards the college player, and the Rangers are certainly in that group. And we talked before I hit the record button about, you know, the Rangers change and MO, I guess, in the draft, going from the Bubba Thompsons of the world, the really toolsy, you know, high school outfielder type raw with a lot of upside and maybe transition into guys like Josh Young and Justin Foscue. What have you noticed about just from the league in general, maybe being more favorable towards the college player, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think analytics having a bigger role in kind of draft decisions and scouting decisions probably plays into that. It's a lot easier to feel the safety of a guy who's performed for 3 years in college. The Woodbat track record in the Cape Cod League plays a part. And I think even kind of where baseball is going in the future with some of the lower levels of the minor leagues being removed, I think you could see teams kind of continue this trend where without as many levels to the minor leagues, without as many minor league teams, maybe you feel even more comfortable going with kind of a college player who's proven himself at a higher level. Maybe teams are more willing to let colleges do some of that early development for players. And then you can kind of get rid of some of the risk that comes along with these high school players inherently. And I don't think the high level, high upside high school prospect is ever going away, just because you get a chance to get these guys before they get to college and prove themselves and become more expensive. So there is that risk reward calculus that's always going to come into play. But I think the Rangers are a team that has certainly pivoted a little bit towards maybe more of that proven college player in the last few years. I think the Atlanta Braves would be another example of a team that's gotten a little bit more analytically inclined. They were a team that previously loved taking high upside high school pitchers. The last few years, they've taken a few proven college players. Shea Langoliers, Braden Shoemake are two examples of that I think are kind of similar to how the Rangers have shifted their philosophy. Now, you can have success in all sorts of different ways, but I do think generally the trend is to go for more college players. And I don't really see anything to make me kind of steer away from that in the future.
All right, two more for you, Carlos. One specific to the Rangers pick. Last time they picked this high, they were 4th overall in the 2015 draft after a really tough 2014 season. And I guess the difference there was the Rangers 2014 was bad because of injuries. They came back in 2015, won the division, did it again in 2016. Don't know if that's in the cards this year. They took Dylan Tate, 4th overall that year, with Andrew Benintendi on the board. I know they loved Alex Bregman. He didn't fall to them. I think the thought was that maybe Andrew Benintendi wasn't big enough. And listen, it's not like he's a perennial all-star by any means, but Dylan Tate, certainly not someone that with the 4th overall pick, based on his production, you would maybe expect to take. With the second pick, obviously it's not going to change your organization overnight, but you do have the opportunity to get a really, really big impact player. I'm just curious, like from your time just diving into the draft, what are things to consider with a pick that high? Because whenever you pick that high, you don't want to pick that high again for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, I know everyone wants to find the next, Hall of Fame franchise player, but what are the things you necessarily look for?
Yeah, I think it just kind of depends on the class. It depends on the players. Every class is a little bit different and every class is unique. But at the end of the day, I think you just have to trust your scouts to basically identify the top players and then separate those top players into the tiers that you think are accurate. It's a tough job. There's a reason that the baseball draft has less accuracy than the NBA and the NFL drafts. There's just so many levels in between kind of where these players are at now and where they have to go. I think that it's a real commodity hitting at the top of the draft. I think those players, the players that separate themselves as the elite hitters in the class, I think it's very tempting for me to kind of avoid the risk that is inherent with pitchers. I mean, pitching prospects are just simply more risky just because of their injury rates. So I do think this is why you see kind of the hitters climb as we move towards the draft and some of the pitchers slide down. So I think if you can do a good job identifying a hit tool, and generally at the top of the draft, you'll have a good chance to get a guy who has a really impressive hit tool, maybe a 60 or 70 hit tool potential with supplemental tools. A guy like Austin Martin was my personal favorite from last year's class. He went 5th. I think if you have a chance to get one of those guys who can be impact type, everyday hitters in the middle or atop of the lineup, those are the players that I personally think you need to go for. Obviously, if you can hit on that top of the rotation pitcher, that's something that maybe is the most rare player in today's game, but there's just so much risk that comes with that I would really want to have that one right. So I think if you're picking at the top, you want to get that hitter. Whether or not that hitter is there for you is another question.
All right, last one, Carlos. Invariably, every year, I don't know if it's just with the Rangers set of beat writers or if this happens with all organizations, but John Daniels gets asked whether or not he'd be in favor of teams being able to trade picks like they can in other sports. And he's actually, if I'm not mistaken, unless his opinions change, he's kind of been open-minded and said that he would be open to rules that would allow for that. I'm just curious your thoughts, because that's obviously a unique element. I know some changes have been made the last couple of years as far as this is concerned, but you can't just freewheel and deal the second overall pick if you want to trade down and get more, just the way we see other sports operate. Where do you stand on the structure of the draft and maybe whether or not teams should be allowed to trade picks a little more than they're currently able to?
Yeah, I think my thoughts on this one have kind of evolved a little bit. I used to be super hard against that just because selfishly, from my perspective, it would make covering the draft much more complicated. But I do think that trading picks adds plenty of interest from the fan perspective. I mean, if you're a team that is really good at drafting, having the ability to kind of maneuver and add more picks or move your picks higher up the board, I think is an option that would add more interest to the draft from a fan perspective, and also allow teams to just be more creative in how they build. If you either don't want to invest a ton in the draft or you don't trust yourself in the draft as much, maybe you trade away from some strength that you have there in terms of picks and move that into assets that can help you win now. I think that I don't know that if it will happen. I think there is probably some hesitance from MLB's side to maybe stack the deck against, for the teams who do it really well. I think they get another advantage being able to trade picks. They might take advantage of some teams who either don't do a good job or just don't want to spend. I think that would be the concern in trading picks. I wouldn't want to have a situation where you run into a team that just doesn't want to invest in the draft at all and just trades their picks away. I don't know if that would be a realistic outcome, but I can see some of the pros and cons. I think it would add some interest, and I think teams generally should be allowed to kind of build their team however they choose. And if trading picks becomes something that they want to do in the future, I think it would be interesting. And I think most fans would probably be for it. Kind of how it practically comes together, I guess, would be the question for me.